Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into connectedness and relationships, and I am so excited to be here today with Elisabeth Shaw, the CEO of Relationships Australia New South Wales. Welcome, Elisabeth.
Thank you.
Elisabeth, your academic background, in addition to the undergrad degree you hold, is a Master's in Management, a Master's in Couple Family Therapy, a Master's in Professional Ethics, and your career path, which has included coaching, consulting, and of course your current role as CEO of Relationships Australia New South Wales, has a clear theme to me, and that's around relationships. So what has drawn you to working and studying in the field of relationships?
Thanks, Gohar, and it's great to be here. I'm really looking forward to the conversation too, because of course it's dear to
Just
my
a bit
heart.
closer
To here?
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a bit of a running joke about people that join the helping professions that we've been therapists in our own families. And in fact, there have been studies on this, particularly for nurses and social workers, that, the role that they might have played in their own family, maybe they came from a family where there were particular problems or dynamics. And so I only read that once I was in the field, but I think that was probably true. In my own small mind, I was my family's family therapist from the age of about 12. And I'm sure if they were here, they would deny this and think that I was being grandiose and that they were all perfectly functioning fine. But I have my doubts. So I think there is something about being drawn to human behaviour and fascination with human behaviour, which led me to do psychology and then postgraduate in clinical psychology, so mental health. But certainly when I was just sort of through a series of coincidences said, did you know that there's a family therapy program? And that immediately spoke to me. And so yes, it was the first qualification I stumbled into, and you can hear I've been a collector of qualifications, and it has been a deep love ever since. And so it's not just because it makes sense to think of us in relational terms, but since then, of course, I've done a lot of other investigation and reading, and we know there's a very long-standing study carried out by Harvard University, an 86-year longitudinal study that looks at what in the end is the key characteristic of a satisfying life, and it is relationships. So I think we all know this. We kind of intuitively know that the quality of our relationships speaks to the guts of our life satisfaction. And so really everything in my career just keeps reinforcing my career choice. It's endlessly fascinating, endlessly rich, and it's very heartfelt work. So it's been a privilege to work in the area of psychology that I have.
Just picking up on that point that you just made about the 86-year-long research that was done, and relationships being a key part of having a fulfilling life. What does that look like? What does connectedness and having good relationships in your life, what does that look like in terms of you as an individual? How do you know when you're hitting that mark, when it's not too much, when it's not too little? How do you know you've hit the right mark?
Look, it's a big question because everybody will define that very differently. And I think it's very important to have permission to define it differently because you would all know and know other people who are very satisfied and enriched with just having 2 or 3 really close friends and maybe a few other acquaintances, but really feel very satisfied and nourished by that. And others seem to need big groups of people, need to be involved in everything and have big social lives. And if they're not doing something with others all the time, they feel really down. So it's very important to define it in a very flexible way, and that there is no right way. It's not about judgment or feeling, gee, I've only got 2 friends, that's a bit sort of hopeless, because that might be more than enough. So I think, intimacy and connection is very personal. I think for me, fundamentally, it's the feeling that you're held in mind by somebody. And those moments where you feel visible and worthy and that you matter. And so good friends and family will, in various ways, give us that feedback. But you also can get little bits of that if you stop and look for them. If you go to your coffee shop in the morning and they say, "Oh, flat white." Now, they may not know my name, but there's little moments where you're remembered, or there might be a lunch order, or it might be the person who's dog walking at the same time as you, and you have a bit of a smile, here we are again. I think in those moments where you feel like you're noticed and there's a shared experience, not to underestimate those little connections which make you feel like you're in a community and you're having connected experiences.
So it sounds like it's an ecosystem that you're looking for. It can be sometimes when you do recognise that maybe that ecosystem isn't quite there for you, and you decide to make a change in your life and that you're ready to maybe go back out and make sure that you are more connected. Where is a good place to start? Because I think often we forget that social connections can actually be really difficult to make. So what would you recommend as being the first step to take?
Look, it is very difficult, and sometimes we judge how we're going by whether other people seem to want us. So there's a sense, well, no one's asking me out, or no one said good morning to me. So we tend to build a case that perhaps that's something about our worth or how difficult it's going to be. And so we lose our own power. And it's important, it's more empowering to think about, well, what could I do? Like, what's my part in this interaction? Because as soon as you have something to do, you've taken your power back in a sense. Because instead of being at the mercy of whether other people notice you, you've got a chance to draw their attention. And so it may well be like a small thing that I did during COVID was I just thought while I'm walking the dog, I'm just going to say good morning to everybody. And I might be lost in my own head and usually don't feel the need to say that. And I just thought, I'm just going to do that. And I found everyone was very willing to say good morning back, and there was something nice about saying something out loud and someone saying something back. And I remember when I went back to work, I was in the lift and I was just in silence in the lift, as you do. And when the person got out of the lift, they said, "Have a nice day." I hadn't said anything else to them, and they disappeared and the doors shut. And that's a nice thing to say. And so it did occur to me that that being able to initiate something and draw a response. If you do go and buy your coffee, do you say, "Good morning, how was your weekend?" or "Here we are again," or anything that says, I could make this more than a transaction. It's like a tiny thing. So I think we need to look at what are we initiating, not just what offers do we get. So I think to start like that, sometimes we've convinced ourselves that no one wants us, when in fact we might be giving off the vibe that we have no need for them. So I think to start really small and savour the response, savour what you appear to get back. And enjoy it. And then, like that moment in the lift, that was years ago now, it's always stayed with me because I got a little jolt that someone put out a positive statement to me that they didn't need to say that. So I think we could look at that. We could claim some of those moments. I think too, don't be afraid to initiate something. If you have a friend and you think, oh, they're too busy, that most people are looking for the good offer. And so we all like to be asked. And so to think, well, just as you'd like to be asked, other people might like to be asked. What you need to be careful of is not assuming that if they say no, you should give up on that strategy. Well, I knew it, I'm not wanted and, I don't matter to anybody. Instead to say, well, that didn't suit on that occasion. You can still feel quite proud of yourself for asking, giving it a go. They might come back to you because at least you've conveyed, I'm on for an activity, I'm available, I'd like to hang out with you. So you've achieved quite a lot, even if they said, sorry, I'm busy on Saturday. You've achieved quite a lot in just putting yourself out there as a person who could be asked. So don't underestimate these small building blocks, and do see what vibe am I giving off. Have I in fact closed off to the point to protect myself from rejection? Have I closed off and people would think I seem to look fine without them?
So moving on, so following on from that, when we do find people that we're in relationships with, be it with family, be it with friends, be it with loved ones, how do we know, or what are the telltale signs of a good relationship? How do we know that this relationship is one that's healthy and is working well?
Well, I think what may or may not surprise you is that really the way to test a good relationship is when you hit the hard times. It's not very difficult to have a relationship that's going well, in a sense, particularly if it's reasonably superficial or transactional. You can have quite a lovely time with someone and, keep it at a certain level that works for both of you. But where a relationship is of value and you both want to stick it out and you're both prepared to do the hard yards is when you've had a little tussle about something or a little disappointment, and you've either recovered, not by shoving everything underground, but you've recovered because you talked it through, everybody took responsibility, there was a chance to feel like, we matter enough to have worked that out. Then a relationship has depth and can survive the tougher times. So a good relationship is not just about being happy at all times, and it's actually about working some things through. And that doesn't have to be big, deep and meaningfuls, but it does need to have enough of the other skills and persistence to have longevity.
When I think back to some of, relationships in my life, be it friends or things like that, there's a handful of relationships that I can think where I really enjoyed that relationship, but maybe something small happened that turned into something big and it broke that relationship down. And now, with hindsight, I can think, I really miss that person in my life. I really, be it 1 year on, be it 5 years on, be it 10 years on, I think to myself, my life would have a much better meaning with that person in my life. How can you go back to that relationship? Should you go back to that relationship? Is it that some relationships that maybe that tiff was a sign that it wasn't a good relationship, that you couldn't work through it? But if you do want to go back, what are the sort of first steps that you should think about in doing that?
Well, I think what's really important is to own your own part in what's happened and think, well, I'm at least prepared to offer that. And you've got to do it because it's important to you, not because it has to have a particular outcome. So because we can't control other people, unfortunately, and they may turn us down or they may turn away, or they may say, actually, I've moved on, I don't need you anymore, and that could be very hurtful. So you've got to be able to take the risk. And it is amazing, in my work, because I still do clinical work, how many people have had these moments at school reunions. I don't know if you've had these, but I've heard so many stories about school reunions where people have gone back and felt shame and embarrassment about the way I treated that person, or facing the bully again, or facing the mean girls, or whatever it might be, and really needing to think about this. How do I want to navigate the moment? But in those cringy moments, sometimes the thing we're hanging on to, the other person isn't hanging on to too. And you've got to remember that you might think, remember that funny argument we had and we walked away and never spoke again. They don't remember the argument. They just thought you were busy and forgot to, ring them. So I've also had those moments. So just to remember what looms large in our minds has taken on a life of its own. But I think you've got to go and not only sort of account for what happened, have a good explanation. So it may be, I was thinking of you lately and you pop into my mind a lot since we haven't been in contact. And, to me it feels like we fell out over that argument and we never got back. And I've actually missed you. I think trying to join the dots for them, because they might think, well, she rang me a year later. So I think trying to say this and not assume that they're all ready to talk about it or that they see it the same way I also think that as you get older, you look back and you've got more skills too. So you look back and cringe a bit at your younger self, don't you? And think, oh, I could have handled that better. But if in fact you're still having umbrage, I want to ring them because they should account for themselves, that's probably not going to go so well.
That's very good advice. I guess one of the themes of what you're talking about here is about personal responsibility in relationships. Is there a process for that for a person to go through, not just through relationships that, may have broken down, but through everyday relationships that we have? What does being a good partner in that relationship look like? What should you be doing to make sure that that relationship is flourishing?
Yeah, again, it can be very sort of specific to the relationship, because you don't want to overwork at your relationships, because that's exhausting and unnecessary and sometimes is intrusive, and it's a whole lot of things. But nor should you underwork. So I think many people have the experience of, oh, why am I always the one that rings and sets things up or whatever? And sometimes you've just taken up a role and everyone gets used to you doing it. They're not trying to be sloppy or take advantage of you, but they just think, oh, you're the social leader and we really value it. So it may be an endorsed position. So I think saying, how did I get myself into this position, is a nice sort of humble question, or it might be, what's my part in what's happened? Whereas what we get caught in is the problem of other people. And so we explain everything by why they let us down, why they're sort of hopeless and inept and rude and whatever. And we tend not to think about how we've bought into it, maybe how we started the cycle going. So it's not about apportioning blame. It's not about, well, kick yourself instead of them. It's just about saying relationships are co-constructed, that everything is interactional. And so we have to have been part of what happened. Even if we feel like we're at their mercy, they're a bigger personality or they're a dominant personality, it's still thinking, okay, so if they're a dominant personality, how do I relate to a dominant personality? What am I going to do to work with that? Rather than, well, if they keep doing that, I only get to be this small thing. It's trying to think of it interactionally and own your own part in it. You don't have to over-own it. You don't have to be apologetic to the point that's unnecessary, because that really doesn't offer any growth to the relationship either, for one to just fall on their sword all the time. But it's trying to think about that, and to also bear in mind that in a relationship that you really don't think you can influence, and one that you may have tried everything you can and it just isn't turning out the way that you want, stepping back from it for a while, or sometimes walking away. There are times in your life where you just clash a bit more, or you're at different places. You could step back for a while and maybe find each other later. Not every relationship should be measured on whether you've known them for 50 years. Some people come and go, and you might miss them, but you know full well why you left them behind or they left you behind. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think just drawing along with that theme of how you can look out for each other in a relationship. I think sometimes people go through different cycles in their life where they're really involved and really active and really connected well, but sometimes there's a lull in the level of activity, and maybe you see that in a friend or in a family member and you're a bit concerned about them, that maybe they're not as connected as maybe they should be or could be or may want to be. How do you broach that topic with someone without, exactly as you were saying before, becoming too intrusive or too overbearing? What's a way that you could possibly help somebody who you think might need a little bit of help and a little bit more of a boost getting back in?
Look, I think one of the things that a good friend or family member could do is, again, on that point of being visible to others, is having a kind, curious person in your corner who just says, look, I notice you used to go out all the time and you're not going out as much. What's that like for you? Or is that intentional, So I think it's opening a wider conversation, like, are you lonely?
Yeah.
But it's more like, oh, it just seems different. Or, I knew you when you were more, always bushwalking and actually haven't talked about that for years. Did you go off it? Or, I think it's just being curious and opening up a space to say, I notice you and I notice this shift and I just wonder what that means, or even, look, we don't hang out as much as we used to. I've sort of thought maybe you're too busy, but maybe I've got that wrong and I just wanted to check in with you. I think it's important to have a non-pathologising, non-critical question, non-accusatory question, not one that makes them feel bad, because I think a good friend might say, you know what, you're right, thanks for noticing, or it might clear the air in some ways. I think it's good to just plant a seed, even if they initially bat it away and say, oh no, that's not true at all. You at least have planted a seed. Maybe they'll think about that if they need to.
That's great advice. And I think that's sort of looking at it from one side where one person may have fallen down a bit, but there's also dynamic changes in relationships that happen naturally. So, for example, children and their parents as people grow older, and that's something that I'm experiencing at the moment, and it can cause some tension. Our roles are changing within that relationship. The paths that we're taking changes within that relationship. How do you navigate, or where do you start navigating those kinds of changes in roles in relationships?
Well, in terms of the social roles, I mean, of course, the whole domestic roles is a can of worms in and of itself as to who's doing the jobs in the house. So we could, if you meant that, we can go down that track. In terms of the roles in the family, I think it's very interesting that across the lifespan, what people are often navigating are various big themes, one of which is separateness and togetherness. So when a couple first gets together, they're very focused on the two of you, reinforcing, bedding that down. But then a couple that become consolidated and secure can then together turn and face the world, if you like. They can put more energy into their career or whatever. And then, there are children. Sometimes you then batten down the hatches again and you focus on that. And then everyone's worlds open up again, like your children need you, then they don't need you. Or they don't look like they need you, but they still need you. And, it's complicated. And then they get older and they still need you. So there's lots of different things, but if you look at the running theme, it's often about separateness and togetherness. It's one of the themes. So relationships where that goes well is where you can fluidly manage the comings together and the movings apart without getting stuck in somebody trying to pin the other down or someone finding that a problem. And it really means not just observing, they don't seem to need me, but how you talk about it, how you navigate it, how you negotiate it over time. So I think seeing a family or caring unit with comings and goings, and then there's often children moving back home and grandparenting duties, and each one is a transaction about coming close, moving away. There's quite an art.
Yeah.
It's a delicate balance. And I think in terms of some of the labour questions, just to touch on that, because I was rereading all the literature on that, and that's a very gendered experience. But in relation to this question, one of the things that isn't very well navigated, and I see this with couples all the time, is that there's certain themes that they set and forget. Like they work out finances, or they work out domestic roles, and they set and forget, never to be discussed again, but lots of resentment building. So that often the research says that couples, for example, can be reasonably egalitarian around household duties until they have children, and then there can be a split around who's at home, those sorts of traditional things. But after that, they're not at all good at rediscussing, re-navigating, and that's where it gets stuck in a very gendered pattern. But it is because they haven't stopped and renegotiated it. So even when other changes happen, like, for example, if a woman's been at home and she goes back to work, she just keeps the bigger load. So I think, again, this is always about communication, effective communication, and noticing together, not letting things just happen and resentment building. So if you're carrying around a sense of something unresolved or irritation or resentment, it affects your mental health really badly, and it actually ruins how you feel about the other person, because you've got a head of steam about them and their sloppy behaviour and their lack of goodwill and all of these things you've got in your head. But have you actually talked it out? And how have you talked it out, more to the point? Because, gee, I've heard some really bad ways to talk things out. And that just inevitably goes pear-shaped and then becomes evidence that you hold on to that too. So I think good relationships are always going to be about acceptance, about belonging and disconnection, separateness and together. These are the big themes that we work with across our lifespan.
So sometimes we get to a point in a relationship where the relationship's breaking down, or headed that way at least. When do we know it's time to get professional help in, and when is it appropriate to do so?
Well, of course, I would say early. And nobody does that, so I'll say it and no one will ever think to do it. And it's partly, people will get help for their children earlier. So I often see children sort of shuffled in, even though children themselves can know full well that's not where the problem lies. I remember many years ago seeing a family with this tiny tot. It must have been 3, let's say, maybe not quite 3. And I said, who's the best at fighting in this family? And this child said, Mum and Dad. And it was sort of running behind their chairs at the time. And that was where the problem was, and the problem for that family at that time. And so kids always, they have your number always, don't they, unfortunately. You can't hide anything, really. You think you can, but you actually... can't. So I can't remember the question now. I've got deviated.
The story was so good.
It's broken down. So, look, I have seen so many, because I do a lot of couple work, I have seen so many couples over the years that say to me at some point, if only we'd come earlier, because there's lots of things we're doing differently, and we put up with that for far too long, because in fact, if you just work with people, often a different way of seeing it, drawing on their own resources, noting their own strengths, a few new ideas, and they're often running. And so sometimes couples think that there is a particular issue that is the problem. I have very commonly seen that the issue is not the problem, the way they're talking about it is the problem. And so they've got ground into a way of talking about it that's boring, conflictual, there's an impasse, and with some different relationship skills, the content is not. It's often they can live with that perfectly fine. So I think the thing is that there's this pervasive idea that if you're a functioning, happy couple, you should be able to resource yourselves entirely. Surely. I've had so many people say to me, "Well, this is the kiss of death, seeing you." Because, only a couple really on the brink of divorce. And some have said, I feel like I've been dragged here to find out you're leaving me, which is actually really sad, because often mostly the other person just says, no, I'm just really desperate to get through to you. Yeah. And they've dreaded it. And they've come to the session under great stress. So I think the stereotype that therapy is for really... hopeless people who can't get their act together, or it's going to be shaming, or you're going to be exposed, really gets in the way of just getting some easy practical help early along in the journey.
I think there's also an idea that counselling or therapy for relationships is just for people in a partnered relationship, so husband and wife, or de facto, or girlfriend and boyfriend, or so be it. But at Relationships Australia New South Wales, a much broader sort of look at relationships is taken. What other kinds of relationships can you get assistance for, or should you get assistance for, to help navigate those dynamics?
Look, about a third of our clients at Relationships Australia come alone, and that's for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they are the only one wanting help, or they just, they're the ones who want to reflect on where things are up to. So sometimes it's because a partner doesn't want to come, but often it is because they just prefer it, or they've tapped into it as a resource throughout their life. And it can be about workplace relationships, identity, one's relationship to oneself. It may be sibling relationships or, family of origin experiences that are still hanging around. Not everybody has grown up in a conventional family form, so sometimes we are working with multiple families. I think there's a lot about all of that means that we need to have a really broader view of families and also intergenerational families. So we do some work in one of our projects, for example, with, two actually, with grandparents, and will involve grandchildren. So some intergenerational work as well. And we certainly do work in workplaces and organisations to do team building and, navigating conflict where that's arisen too, and skilling people up. So lots of contexts, and, if for those of you who've had really sticky moments at work, it can hugely influence your morale and your self-esteem and your mental well-being, and it can really detract from your home life because you go home stewing, you're often closed off, your family say, there you are at the computer again. So I think we can't underestimate that when something's not working in one part of our lives, everybody who's closest to us feels that. And I actually had a colleague say to me recently, I see it this way, that I'm a very shallow pond when I get home. It's a lovely image. Said, I'm a very shallow pond. I work with people all the time, but when I get home, if one of my children says, I've had a bad day, he says, you'll be right, because he just said, I've got nothing left. So, of course, and I thought that shallow pond idea was gorgeous. But I think we do need to say, well, what am I going home with? Have I got anything left for the relationships that are actually supposed to be most important to me? And I have to say, hand on heart, I'm not always that person either. In fact, if my family was here, they might say, I'm infrequently that person. Do you need water?
No, I'm okay.
I can look after you in this
Thank you.
but my children may not say that.
I might open up to the audience and see if there's any questions from the audience.
I'm interested in the concept of communication, of course, being the key. But the thing is, I'm not talking about a family relationship now, so there's no actual abuse as such in the family, but a neighbour, okay. Now, the relationship initially, years ago, was good. Things have deteriorated now. So that if I would try and broach communication about something, there'd be screaming match. Hysteria, and there's no way I could get past that. I'd be abused. So what sort of strategies do you think could you suggest? That I've tried a nice little card when something has to be discussed because it's a neighbour thing, you have to talk about things sometimes. So I put a card in a letterbox, so that sort of works for a while, but it doesn't work. So can you suggest some strategies that I might sort of repair this a little bit?
Well, it depends what outcome you want. Because if you just want to take the volatility down a notch so that you can see them in the driveway without screaming, then that's one part of it. If you want to go back to having them over for dinner once a week, that's a bigger goal. So I think I think the things that you've already tried sound a good place to start, in that often it is really about, again, coming back to what you can control, which is yourself. So it's about saying, well, what sort of person do I want to be in the neighbourhood? Because really our greatest resource is ourselves in any relationship. So it's how do I go forth into my neighbourhood and never lose myself? So that's quite empowering, because you can at least achieve that. So if for you think, well, the sort of neighbour I would want to be with anybody is I'd want to be able to smile and wave at anybody. I don't have to be their best friend, but I just want to be able to do that. And so that might be your goal, that and Christmas cards, and if there's a street party, you let them know that's on, or, So you might just say, I'm just going to do the minimal. But I think if someone is very, volatile or aggressive, if all you're doing is smiling and waving, then unless they're quite unwell, to be honest, that would be not very inflammatory. And at the very least, even if they don't respond initially, they're just a bit stumped and they just don't look like they've registered. It's not about whether they've responded, it's about whether you were true to yourself. Then you can go inside instead of thinking, they didn't even smile back. That's not your measure. Your measure is whether you could hold on to yourself. But if they also, because people do it automatically, you wave, they might just mirror you before they've realised. And suddenly you've had a moment that is easier. And then if this is a neighbour that volatility can start up again, you possibly are safest just to keep it at that level of relationship. Yeah.
She's determined to hate me, but okay, I know what you're saying. I will try and control myself.
Yeah. Well, she might hate you, but then you can decide, am I going to be hateable? And that's, but that's what often happens is that, I see people where they've got into it with each other and then backing down or becoming different actually becomes very hard because there's pride involved.
Well, I find you have to stand up to a certain way because she takes advantage. If you show weakness, then anyway, thank you. That's good. I've got more questions about the other people.
Being pleasant's not being weak, so you can do that. Yeah.
Hi, we've been talking about relationships and my brain keeps saying, what about friendships? Yeah. Now, is there an expectation that at some level a relationship will form into a friendship or is there an expectation or do you see signs that someone will want more than just yes, there are relationships with co-workers, etc., but when you're talking about people you meet and constantly see, does that develop into a friendship and what are the differences? How do you approach?
So are you talking about friends who could become romantic partners?
No, just
friends.
Yes, a friendship.
People you meet to turn into a friend.
Exactly, that you click with, that won't get into any kind of romance, but they become friends as opposed to just the neighbours that you've got a relationship with that you give a Christmas card to and say hello to. So does that go one way or does that move towards the other? Because all we've been talking about is relationships, but that word friendship to me is a treasure.
Look, it's an absolute treasure and friendships provide often all the scaffolding around everything else, don't they? Because unfortunately partners can come and go and friends can come and go too. And so many of the themes that I've talked about fit for friendships too, around separateness and togetherness and changes over time where you might live in each other's pockets and then you don't see them for a while because you've got small children or you're busy or you moved interstate and then you come back. So I think a good friendship also has some elasticity in it. Where there isn't judgment. And a lot of people get into the same themes around being insecure and defensive and ruminating and suffocating and conflictual. All of these things play out in friendships too. So again, all that I said earlier about owning your own part in it and trying to audit, what do I need from friends right now? Do I actually need more than any one friend could provide? Am I so lonely that I could accidentally fall into being more grasping? Or am I so closed off that maybe I'm not showing enough warmth? So I think it is trying to work out where you are in your social world. And then in terms of people you meet, I think you often need just enough conversation to move to the next thing. So to be able to stop in the street or at the morning tea or whatever and ask enough that they, when you say, well, what do you like doing? And they say, I like the art gallery. And you can say, well, so do I. Maybe we could go one day. You'll get a reading of whether they're on for that or not. But you need just enough conversation to have a hook. And also I think we can get very shy about saying something warm, like, gee, I've enjoyed our conversation. Now that could feel very intimate. We use the word intimacy often about romantic relationships. There's a lot of intimacy. I mean, even in work relationships, dipping down into how are we going is a more qualitatively intimate conversation. And so putting out a nice compliment could feel, quite a big disclosure, but if you were on the receiving end of that, wouldn't that feel lovely? And so sort of just pleasant affirmation can also go a long way to having a little bit more of that relationship. Remembering basic skills like everybody loves to be listened to. And the trouble is somebody's got to do the talking. But even thinking about how much am I talking compared to how much am I listening, and would the other person feel heard by me, and do I even notice who did most of the talking? I think some of those things are important. I think if you come home from seeing a friend and maybe your family says, how are they? And you say, well, actually, now you say that, I don't know, I asked any questions. And that can happen, with a good friend in particular, that can happen, that they're going through something or you are and you take all the space. But that's a common trap, is not being self-aware enough. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Excellent. So we'll go down here, then to the back there, and then over there.
As the positive from this show is, I don't talk with my brother. He lives overseas. When I visit, he put me down. But from this show that you talk, I definitely will write him a letter and explain myself. And I'm very happy that I came.
That's lovely. Thank you.
It's lovely.
Thank you.
And I think that is lovely, because it matters to you to be back in touch with him. And it is worth, when you're making such a big overture, such a big thing to do, is just to remember that it'd be lovely if he says the right things back. He might get them wrong. He might forget to write back, or he writes back 3 lines and you wrote a 4-page letter. You've just got to be ready to warm the relationship up again. It'll go where it goes. And also just really remember his story of the relationship could be different to yours. Yeah. So I think to write to someone who has a different story, to just remember them. Yeah, exactly. And if he's open to understanding, then you will be well received. If he's someone who isn't very open to understanding or may not even see the value in it, you might start in a different place. It may be the first letter could be, I'd love to be in more regular touch with you, you're often on my mind. That might be a nice way to open it. I mean, I don't know the circumstances, it's up to you, but it's sometimes people, when they've had disconnection, make their big play first up, and there's too much on the table and there's too much at stake. And sometimes if the other person isn't as ready as you for the big discussion, they go, whoa, So sometimes warming them up to the interaction, just some general tips.
I understand what you said, but I think when you write in this letter how I feel, you also need to say positive what I feel about him.
Oh, absolutely. That would be lovely. Yeah. Yeah.
How he means for me.
Exactly.
So I think
Yeah. And he obviously means a lot. Yeah.
And so it's about expectation management there as well, isn't it, Elisabeth? Yeah.
Well, managing your own, because what you don't want is more reinforcement for your earlier negative thoughts. Because you could easily think, I knew it, they don't want me in their lives. When that may or may not, it may be that the overture or the way that it started, or, the number of people who pounce when their family member walks through the door and the other says, can you give me a minute? I knew you didn't want to talk to me. I think we've got to do timing, we've got to be thoughtful, we've got to stand in the other's shoes, we've got to look at our own part in it. You can do this in 5 minutes. It's not weeks of study. It might be weeks of study, but they're just skills and routines you need to get into.
Absolutely. I think we had another question just near the pole over there. Siobhan, just behind the pole.
Hi, I've got a question. It's about jealousy. So at different times in my life, like right from the school playground, or work, or school mums and things, there'd be times where when it's happening to you, you just don't see it. In fact, I was probably in my 40s before one of my school friends said, no, what she was doing back then, she was jealous of you. So you don't see it. And when I've sort of been able to then see it happening in subsequent years, what I found was it was really hard to develop the relationship because, or evolve or sort out the problem, because the person was jealous of you, and hey, I'm nothing special, right? So,
I'm sure you are.
The person would be jealous of something, but you'd never then have the real conversation because it was always, oh, but you do this, you did that, and there was a lot of blame thrown. But ultimately, it came down to it was the feelings they had because maybe I'd done something well, so it was the feelings they'd had. And I felt completely powerless because I would be racing around trying to do everything to please them and never getting it right because it was never actually dealing with what the real problem was, which, like, I was well into my 40s before I even understood some of this dynamic I'd had in the playground that I'd subsequently had, you know, in other areas. So, you know, I'm done and dusted with all of that now, but I suppose what's sort of in the back of my mind is, what could I have done differently, be it in the playground with the school mums, you know, in the work environment where somebody else has a problem and I want a positive relationship, but they wouldn't even necessarily acknowledge that it was, like, the way I just put it simply, is like something I'd done well that they didn't like that I'd actually done well or been successful. What do you do in those situations?
Well, you know, you possibly can't do anything. So I guess is the short answer, because some of it you're not even aware of and you can never verify it was the case, you know, so someone else has observed it and thought that could be it, and probably in the schoolyard it might have been that. I mean, I guess in different stages of life and depending on the roles you've played and the way you've moved about in your community, people can have issue with you for reasons of their own. That's true. And stuff can be projected onto you. So as a CEO, I get that all the time because you have a role and people have fantasies about roles, about you being, you know, the good mother, the sort of the wise guide, the sort of the visionary, the, you know, whatever it is. I've got no chance. You know, I'm not going to do any of those things. You know, I'll be a flawed, sort of haphazard kind of floundering around, the best leader I can come up with, but I'm not going to. There's a lot of things I hear and I think, oh well, I was never going to promise to serve that up to you, but that's part of the deal. So I think as soon as you have a role, like whether it's the head of the P&C or that whatever it is, hierarchy and certain jobs attract projections of various sorts. Doctors get it all the time. So I think we have to be humble. We have to be open to feedback anyway, because the fact that stuff's being maybe landed on us that's other people's history, we still have a role to play in being a decent, good person and trying to meet their needs. So if I was to write off everything that anyone ever said to me as their stuff, I think that would be a very defensive position too. So I always think, look, a lot of that doesn't feel like it belongs to me, but that bit I could have done better. Or that bit I can see why it hooked into your stuff. Or I could see if I didn't do that again, that would help our relationship. So there's always learning and listening. I always still say, well, what could I do? And maybe I can do 10% in the direction and maybe not. Yeah. So I think all you can do is use it for learning. Did I consciously or unconsciously buy into that and serve it up? I think that's all you can do.
One quick example, I think where I'd been at a company for 10 years, I got a new boss, and one of the company's values was to be the expert in your field. I'd been there for 10 years. I, was good at what I was doing. I knew a lot of people, but that triggered him because I could do things and I never knew what to do differently. I couldn't be the wallflower because I had then a responsibility to a business to perform and drive programs. But he was my boss, so how could I not try? Do you know? And then, I never knew what to do because.
Well, I think sometimes it is I think how we think about a problem directs all the attempts we make after that. So, for example, once you were onto this jealousy piece, if you started to see that as probably always present in every difficult interaction, you'd always start from, well, how do I manage jealousy? Whereas it may or may not be what was driving each one of these. There may be a certain threat in play. There may have been other dynamics going on. So that's where I think sometimes talking to others about what are the multiple ways I could see this. And often I think to keep myself mobilised, and how I suggest to others to sometimes just think of 3 different ways you could see this. Okay, it could be I threaten him. It could be that, he's insecure. There could be a number of different ways. And then try them on for size as to what could they be. But, sometimes, particularly in a work environment, it's safer to play a straight bat and to just say, look, our relationship doesn't feel as easy as it could be. I wonder if you've picked that up. Do you think there's anything we could do to just improve it? Sometimes I'm not sure what's going on. Or I feel like I might be disappointing you a bit, but I really have no idea. Can we talk? And if you do it light touch, plenty of room, a big open question. If they say, no, I think everything's fine, you think, okay. But if they say, well, then you can get some more information. So I wouldn't draw any conclusions yet. I think there's, different tips in different situations.
Great, thank you.
I've got another question just in the middle there, Siobhan. Thanks.
Thank you. Just wondering, how much has smartphone addiction helped with relationships, and how has it damaged it so much and also affected people in general?
Look, I think access to social media generally has been so incredibly valuable for lots of people who would otherwise feel very lonely and isolated, because there's almost no experience you can go through or no quirky thought you can have that you couldn't find someone online to talk to about it. And that's very comforting, particularly for young people who are trying to work out their identity. There's a lot about that that's important, and it's a great way to counteract loneliness, do some research. So there's just so many ways. It opens up a vista of possibilities. Of course, that can be a black hole into which you can sink. And certainly in my work, couples argue over even their partner. I thought we were watching this on TV together, but you're on your phone. There is that sense, though, it's not about the phone. It's really, you were lost to me. You were lost to me into the phone, into your laptop, into your phone call with your friend. So I think we have to look at where it interrupts intimacy. And so that really is the issue. I think we've got to be, why are people using these mechanisms, and what is the behaviour that is the problem? And certainly there's a lot of hypocrisy where parents want their kids to get off the phone while they're on the phone. And the trouble is, I know myself, when I'm working at home and my kids are there, and I'm working at home, I'd just like to emphasise I'm working at home, and you're there, so therefore you're available. Yeah. And so so I'm typing, and it might be, can I borrow the car? And I think, well, I can't have this conversation right now. So there is something about devices that have become so ordinary that, and of course as an adult, we know that the device, even if I got off emails and stopped working, I might be on the banking app, or I might be booking theatre tickets, or I might be, so I could say, oh, I'm not really on my device, I'm just booking our holiday, but you're on your device. So I think we need to own up to both the value and the issue. But remember, you can do a battle over a device and defend your use of the device. In the end, what the request is, I needed you and you're not there. So if we said that to each other, that's the intimate, who speaks like that? Let's face it, that's a fanciful, that's a Hollywood thing to say. But that is the complaint we need to hear, is because I see couples get into, and family members getting into these nitpicking fights about, I wasn't really on the device, I was doing this for you, and it's not about the device. So we've just got to think about that as well.
Have you been watching My Family, Elizabeth? Because you've just described the dynamics perfectly there with the devices.
I've described my own. That's the thing. We're all in it together.
Got a question down here from Pete.
Thanks. I think one of the difficulties that ageing couples face is the situation where their intellectual and physical capacities change at different rates, and the things that were done in the past don't quite work anymore, and that it involves I think a complex transaction for people, particularly as they haven't necessarily got work or children or the same sorts of outlets that they had previously. I don't know how much that's an issue that I think is a challenge for a lot of ageing couples.
Oh, look, I think that's absolutely true. And couples who can navigate that well can talk about it together and navigate those differences and own up to the differences and say, how do we do this together? Because it's different than we expected, or there's some curveballs, or we do have differences between us. And sometimes couples don't. And certainly I've seen some where they've done this set and forget thing, that they've talked maybe in their 40s, their fantasy about retirement, they're never to be discussed again. And they get that, and then one doesn't actually want to retire, has decided that was a silly idea, I love working or I need to work. And the other says, what about our world cruise? And the other said, not interested, prefer a holiday house or to stay home. And there is a sense of betrayal. There was a promise. There was a promise and a commitment that isn't going to be delivered because the couple hasn't tracked each other in navigating those changes over time. And so they reach a sort of a crisis point where suddenly there's a declaration, you are different to what you promised, or this situation is different to what you promised. And that can be quite a crisis moment. There's certainly, couples who've even talked openly about, well, I think you'll die before me, and, things like this, which sounds like they're quite robust and able to talk about the tough things. And life has a horrible way of things not being as they seem. You don't have the money that you've expected, or your children all move back home, or, things that you can't plan for. So the couples that navigate this have always been able to talk about that in some way and face the reality together and track where they're up to. And it's important to be able to do that. Fewer couples seek help the older they get. Yeah. But I'm seeing a bit more of an increase with that. I think because there's more people separating in their 50s and 60s. And that is because we're living longer. Yes. And so there's a sense of, even at 60, well, I could have 25 years left and I'm not doing it with you. And so, this is happening. This is happening. And so I think settling and silently seething while you're settling is something maybe our grandparents did, and it's not going to be the way forward. So how do we do that? And the stakes are higher the older you get around division of property and who's disadvantaged and who's most likely to repartner, if that's even desirable. And for some people it really is. Yeah. We're also seeing more people living in single-person dwellings. That's for some people a great success story. Some would find that a very lonely idea. Some say, I finally made it. I've got, again, separateness and togetherness. Yeah. I want my own space. I like my own life. I want to dip in and out of all sorts of relationships, but on my terms. It's not about being selfish. It's about being clear who you are and what you need. So I think how we do older age for all of us is, there's a lot in it to be considered, a lot of different options that are emerging. But the same skills are needed by the people travelling through it, which is that ability to be self-aware, accountable for your own stuff, and somewhere being able to talk about it.
So, Elizabeth, where do you start in getting those skills?
Oh, just a journey. It's unfortunately something I stumble over this all the time myself, and think, damn it, another learning opportunity. And when do you come to the end of this? It's very disappointing how many mistakes I find myself still making repetitively. And some new ones. That's always refreshing that I've got some new ones in the mix. So, look, I think it is about being humble and just saying that we are a work in progress and it's okay to make mistakes. It's obviously not at all okay to harm others on our journey. And so, but where we have, there is something we can offer around accountability and repair. So I think there is something about being able to be humble and being open to our own part in things. But if you practice that, it really is a relief because it's the only thing you can control. If you spend a lot of time ruminating on other people, it's just such a fast track to the 3 a.m. worry, which makes great sense at 3 a.m. when you've got a head of steam, and it just doesn't at any other time. So as soon as you've got some steps forward, so I think it's the discipline and the practice of that. And when people give us feedback, and sadly throughout life we can get less feedback, that we stop and really say, shall I take that on, rather than bat it away in a defensive way, particularly people that know us like friends and family. Sadly, they've got our number. Yeah. And even if they've given us the same complaint for 20 years and you want to write them off, maybe there's some truth in it. And if you stop and listen, that could make all the difference too. So yeah, I think there's a lot in all of this that's hard to just, wrap up in a one and done.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Did we have any other questions from the audience? Yeah, okay.
I know you're called Relationships Australia, but do you also deal with individual people who have to navigate a major negative life event such as a life-threatening illness and how basically help them learn how to cope when it's will change their life forever?
Look, absolutely. We see a lot of individuals who, so it's not about having to be a relationship issue. We see a lot of people on their own or in their families talking about navigating a life crisis or new news that is a journey in itself. So absolutely, we absolutely do, yeah.
When you were talking, you mentioned stereotyping, expectations according to how people stereotype and are stereotyped. So strategies, how to overcome that? Like, no one's to blame really because we're just brought up this way, aren't we? We're conditioned all our life in various cultures in different ways, expectations of women, expectations of men. But when you come into a relationship and you want to be yourself, but you're up against this stereotype of how you're supposed to behave, how do you counter that? What strategy do you counter for that?
Well, I think stereotypes make sense. They fit, they come about because they have a ring of truth in them. So, for me, it's always about, well, how does that explain things and how does it not explain things? So it's trying to flip it on its head that it seems to fit, but how might it not fit? Or sometimes it can be a sloppy conclusion. And in fact, where is a stereotype a disadvantage? So an example that I think is very much in our society at the moment is the stereotypes we have about adolescence. So when kids become more silent and grunting back at you or uncommunicative or they don't want to hang out with you, there's so many other parents who can say, oh yeah, they just do that. Or that's what they're like. And it's a comfort as a parent. You think, good, well, my children are not talking to me, so that's normal. I don't have to take it personally and I've got nothing to do because that's just how they are. And that's actually not true at all. It may be certain behaviour, it may have a certain context, but it may be completely the wrong thing to walk away and wait till they're 20 and see if they come out again. So that's an example of where you've always got to say, but what about this person I know in my context? Is my attitude towards it really going to make any difference to how I proceed from here in a positive way? Is it giving me an opportunity to just dip out of responsibilities? So that's, in broad terms, we've always got to ask about that. In terms of any friendship or work relationship, you also develop a reputation when you're known well. So just say you're known as the person who never picks up after themselves. That's your reputation, has a ring of truth about it, So when you try and say, well, I picked up after myself yesterday, but the person says, I'm not letting go of your reputation goes well beyond that. It's also important to know you've got to own it sometimes. You've got to own that, I am sloppy, and to keep doing battle with that's unfair. We have reputations with the people that know us. We have reputations as the person who doesn't do our share, the person who doesn't ring up and invite the others out, the person who never volunteers. And sometimes, you might feel umbrage when someone says, well, you'd never do whatever. Sometimes you've got to say, well, that reputational stereotype, maybe I do need to stop and look at whether a person I'm living with sees me that way, because I actually am that way more than I want to own up to. So that can play out a lot, I find, in interpersonal dynamics.
But classical stereotypes, how a woman should behave and how a man should behave, that sort of thing. To counter that, of course, communications, I know what you're saying. But I'm concerned too. You hear about psychosomatic effects, unresolved conflicts, and how that can affect your body. What sort of experience you've had of that? What can you tell us about that? What have you experienced?
Well, I think what's very well understood now is the mind-body connection is very, very powerful, and so we should never underestimate that. If you feel that there is something about almost a stereotype you feel corralled into in your relationship, it can be that just the way that you talk about it isn't opening that conversation up. That's where, if it's really ground down, it's good to get some help about just hearing each other, listen to each other, because maybe, you may have had this experience, I've had this experience, where you can have an argument with someone you know well. You could write the script. I could give you a bit of paper now and you could write down, I always say this and they always say that, and then I say this and you're smiling away. I've had these discussions with loved ones, and you realise you're in the loop and it's very tiresome. So some of that is about not getting through, and you think, I better shout louder, or I'll repeat it again, and I'll tell them once a day till it sinks in. And in fact, of course, that's a recipe to disaster. But we get caught in this loop where we can't hear each other. And stereotypes are a bit like that, where you feel like something's been decided about you and you can't get yourself out of it. So sometimes it is taking a step back and saying, what is it about the way that I'm putting it that has no cut through? Have they tuned me out for good reason because I'm boring on this subject? I put it in an accusatory way. I start the conversation at the wrong time. And sometimes it is about getting the attention and saying, look, I know a lot of women would do all the housework, and that's not where I'm at the moment. So I think it's sometimes trying to get purchase in the conversation, or a lot of people I know do love talking about their grandchildren, but sometimes I want to talk about something else. And it's trying to own the stereotype, but also own your individualism in the middle of it too.
The stereotype is so ingrained, you can't get past it. The suggestion may be to get mediation. Would you do mediation of some sort?
Well, it depends what the relationship is and its value to you. But absolutely, if it's about a point you're trying to make and it's impeding your life together, then yes, seeing a counsellor, generally it's a counselling problem in that situation, could really help, because sometimes it is about just having someone there as a translator of what it is you're actually trying to say to each other.
Getting past that ingrained stereotype. Yep. Okay, thank you, Lenny.
Yep. When you've been together a long time, you've got so much dirt on each other that, you've got to get through the piles of it before you can, make a difference.
So we've got two more questions and then we'll wrap up. So one over here and then one over here.
Hi. I'm just trying to find out your website on my phone. What's your website?
It's www.relationships.org. Georgina, you'll have to help me. I don't look it up. It's terrible.
So you offer actually free consultation according to the website. Is that correct? Your work is free?
My
Well,
work
this
is
is what
free.
it says.
The Relationships Australia website.
Yes.
We have a lot of services that are free. That's absolutely
Okay.
true. In terms of our counselling, it depends on the funding for the program. We've got about 27 different service streams, lots of different programs, and some of them we do charge fees for. Counselling we charge fees for on a sliding scale according to income. So you can negotiate that when you ring up.
So apparently you have 3 different offices. One is in Barrack Street in Sydney, the other one in Macquarie Park, and the other one in Parramatta. Is this
We've
correct?
got 19 different offices.
In New South Wales.
In New South
Yeah.
Wales, but we're all over the country.
Okay.
I just am involved, and Georgina here, feel free to ask some questions. One of our general managers is here too. So we are in a federated network, so we're from New South Wales, but yes, for family members, we're in every state and territory, and we're all in multiple locations. And we have many of the core programs across all 19 offices. There are some that just have a specific suite.
Okay, it says also that you have some relationship with Lifeline. Is this correct?
We don't have a formal relationship with Lifeline. I have to look up what you're looking up. You're finding all sorts of things. That's not what I thought was on the website. But, I mean, Lifeline refers on to us because Lifeline is a crisis number and they don't do any ongoing counselling. You can ring and it's like a series of individual occasions. There's no ongoing work. So they refer to us a lot when people are ringing about relationship issues.
Okay, so what is your skill expertise for elderly people over 70 who are probably retired, who are in a relationship with someone who might have some disabilities and all this sort of stuff, or who are widowed? Do you have any sort of expertise in that area?
Yeah, well, look, because our organisation, we've been around now 77 years ourselves as an organisation, and we've always worked right across the lifespan. So people who are older traditionally seek services less. So they're actually not visible to a lot of service providers. But we do work right across the lifespan. So in terms of our counselling programs, all of those issues are very familiar to us. In terms of we have a specialised program that is for older people at risk of elder abuse, which unfortunately is really emerging as a more common problem than you would expect, whether it is about coercion or it is about emotional or psychological abuse through to physical or sexual abuse. So we do have a program called Let's Talk, which is specifically around counselling and mediation with adult children and older people where the conflict is such and the issues about perhaps care responsibilities or residential responsibilities or family assets have got them into such risk. So that's a special program. But in terms of the other issues you mentioned, navigating our generalist counselling program, you could certainly book in.
So to see a psychologist, it costs about $250 an hour. So your approach would be definitely cheaper and more accessible to pensioners?
Yeah, absolutely, that is true.
Okay.
You're not able to claim Medicare with us because we're government subsidised. The reason you get a fee rebate is because already the government's paying part of it. So if you had, say, a mental health care plan, many people do this from a GP, you can't use that with us because we have a different subsidy. Instead of Medicare, you have a different subsidy. And certainly for people that can afford it, we charge the full fee.
So the people who work for you are actually counsellors, or what sort of training did they get?
Well, all of them have postgraduate training in relationship specialisation.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody's done an undergraduate degree, and the bulk of our counsellors will have a graduate diploma or a master's degree in couple and family work, or other diploma level qualifications.
That's
in that
very
regard.
good. Thank you very much.
Hi, I've got a question about social skills training. Particularly, we talked about earlier acquaintances and moving from acquaintance to friendship, and the curiosity factor of how to show interest in others and share that space to generate information where you can find commonalities. Do you run any social skills training programs or aware of any?
Look, we don't run them, I must say. I mean, certainly those programs do exist. I can't say off the top of my head. I don't think I can immediately recommend them to you. I think it's actually I wonder if this is actually something that COTA might consider, because it certainly is something we could run, there's no doubt about it. And I think it's a need. It's separate, but we did have a long contract when the Disability Royal Commission was happening, and we were working a lot with people who were vulnerable, a lot of young people, and that's absolutely what came out for them, is that even though they were in the NDIS and receiving other services, what they really wanted is some social skills training and to look at loneliness and learning how to date and learning how to connect. And so it's, you know, I think you're absolutely right to call that out. We shouldn't make assumptions that for older people those are skills you've already got, because you can also lose these skills. You know, when you just, after the pandemic, I think we really saw a loss of skills in the community. That would be, we could partner on that, Gohar.
I think so. I think this is a great idea.
If we ran such a thing, would you know someone you could refer to that, or you would? Yep. Okay.
Excellent. I think there's a next step for us there. Excellent. Thank you all very much for that, for participating in this discussion. Thank you very much, Elisabeth, for bringing your expertise in today and for being so candid and being so nurturing in terms of relationships and where people can go to from here. So we'll put up some of the information about Relationships Australia New South Wales on our website as well. This video will come out, so if anyone wants to go back and have another look at it, they definitely can with those links and that information in there as well.